Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Building a More Intelligent Hybrid Cloud, featuring Forrester Research and brought to you in partnership with Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today I'm proud to be joined by Mr. Dan Deppen. He is a Senior Product Manager at Pivot3, and our guest speaker today is Chris Gardner. He's a Senior Analyst with Infrastructure and Operations at Forrester Research. Before we jump into it, just a few quick housekeeping items that you need to know about when it comes to today's event. We want this to be a really educational event, so I encourage you to use the questions box there in your GoToWebinar client or your console to ask as many questions of our expert presenters as you'd like. We've got a great topic, a lot of great content all about hybrid cloud, so we welcome your questions. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the event, so we'll be holding most of the questions until then. I also want to call your attention to a few handouts that we have there in your console. Pivot3 has a big announcement today related to a new cloud edition. You can download that handout in your console, as well as the Pivot3 Acuity HCI product brochure, and also the Pivot3 Data Center Modernization Guide. So make sure you check out those handouts. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll have a big prize announcement where I'll be giving away a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on today's live event. And with that, let's get started. I'll hand it over now to Mr. Chris Gardner. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. So next slide, please. Thanks. So at Forrester, we focus on a number of pieces of customer enablement and technology and how all these things connect and integrate with one another. And I just wanted to start off by saying that there is a difference between some of the customer enablement technology that's out there and your backend technology. However, they are very much aligned. I've had folks come to me and say, I don't believe this hardware or this hyperconverged infrastructure has a direct impact on my customers, and it absolutely does. So I think what Pivot3 is talking about and what I'll be talking about is super relevant to just about anybody who wants to improve their enterprise's relationship with customers. Next slide, please. So my section is going to be fairly brief. I'm going to give a very quick introduction on who I am and why you should hopefully listen. We're going to talk about hyperconverged infrastructure and how it's kind of gone from being a platform for a couple applications and test use cases to the go-to platform for most of production. And we have a lot of data that clearly backs that up. And then finally, the changing definition and use cases of hybrid cloud. Everyone has a different approach to what hybrid cloud actually means. And we're going to go into that as well as what people are actually doing with it today versus in the past. So next slide. So let's start with the introduction. I am officially, if you were to go to the bio on Forrester's website, the expert on automation, infrastructure as code, hardware. I come from a background of having done this for a living, and the work that I do is pretty heavily influenced by DevOps and culture. However, next slide. I used to do this for a living. I joined Forrester a little over a year and a half ago, and prior to that, I've spent about 15 years starting out as a fairly low-tier sysadmin, then moving into managing critical applications, then moving into being an architect, and then finally moving into strategy. And one of the things that I noticed is talking to not only my clients, but my friends, is that the hybrid IT story has changed, and the different elements and pieces that put it together has changed as well. Next slide, please. So let's go into the specifics of hyperconverged infrastructure. I think that we've long passed the period where clients were asking, what is this thing? And we're actually past the period now where people are saying, okay, let me stand up a POC on this thing. Now they're saying, okay, who's using this for production? How capable is it? So let's go into some actual numbers behind that. Before we do though, let me just mention that it's a kind of an obvious statement to make, but the fact that we have tremendous data growth for the last 5 to 10 years in particular has changed the requirements of what is needed for hyperconverged infrastructure. You know, from a business operations standpoint, we're obviously doing way more in terms of collection and not as much in terms of processing and deletion. So the amount of data that's coming in has greatly increased. The performance requirements have greatly increased. Latency has gone from a stage where you know, it wasn't always needed for every application to being hypercritical for more applications than ever. And the workloads themselves are considered more critical. Folks have little tolerance for downtime. I should mention that as all of this is happening, Edge and IoT has changed the landscape as well. So folks are now pulling in data not only from their own data centers or even the cloud, but all these edge devices and IoT devices that are sending bits and pieces rapidly. So it goes without saying that data is a critical component to how you manage a hybrid workload and hybrid cloud infrastructure. Next slide, please. And because of that, we've seen change. And you know, we can look at it from a architectural level where we started out with core transactional storage and approaches to processing data, to HPC and web scale, to server virtualization of VDI, and then finally to containers and CDRA and infrastructure as code. And as we've gone along, the basics of running an array has given way to wanting to be able to have the agility of treating these pieces of storage like they're software. And certainly cloud has backed that up, but people have also wanted to do this on premise more than ever. So the number of folks that have moved from the traditional arrays to all flash and then finally to software defined storage and hyperconverged is tremendous. And from what we're finding, everyone is using these as production first systems. They're no longer using these as, okay, we'll experiment with this software defined system or this hyperconverged system. We'll only run our virtualized desktops. We're not going to run anything else too. I'm going to put my mission critical data on this thing. I'm going to put my mission critical database environment, my mission critical sales environment. Next slide, please. And when we ask people, you know, what is your adoption at this point of these technologies? We talk about converged and hyperconverged. So the distinction is that hyperconverged usually includes network as part of the equation. Converged infrastructure includes both storage and the server compute side of things. You'll see that most folks are not only implemented, but expanding at this stage. There are a small number that are not interested with no immediate plans, but these tend to be smaller enterprises. The larger enterprises, generally speaking, are going and doubling down on their existing investments. So, you know, it's no longer this environment that is something that people are just looking at and saying, well, I don't know. I mean, we should probably use this for a couple applications. But now let's move as many applications as possible to hyperconverged. Next slide, please. And, you know, this is evident in the workloads that people are running. So obviously, you know, virtual desktop is where a lot of these things got started, and also things in terms of storing video and that kind of thing. But people are now using it for basic operations like file and print, but also critical applications like Oracle, SQL Server. You'll see that's actually the #1 thing that people are using it for nowadays. Also, you're starting to see more analytics be involved with this. As people get more involved with AI and machine learning, they need hyperconverged to squeeze as much performance out of those processes as possible. So you're starting to see a swing a little bit in terms of what workloads are running on these devices. Next slide, please. And when you ask folks, you know, why are you doing this? Performance is obviously important, and cost is obviously important. But what's interesting is that people come to us and say, I'm really in it for flexibility. I like the fact that I can actually slice and dice this thing, that I know that under the hood, there's policies that are taking care of some of the management processes for me and actually doing it better than a human would. And I also like the fact that it's programmable, that I can write to these things as if it was an application, and I can include it as part of my infrastructure as code stack. So what we're finding is that, you know, while it's certainly important that the system is online and it doesn't cost an arm and a leg, equally as important is to be able to tie these to agile application releases and basically configure it exactly the way you wanted it, versus in the past perhaps having to kind of jury rig a configuration around these things. Next slide, please. So just to sum it up real quick, HCI has gone from a platform of test to production. Flexibility is a key driver. It's not always cost and performance. And there's an expectation that, just to be clear, that HCI plays nice with other technologies, including cloud. One of the things that I need to mention is that integration is critical here. And folks, while these boxes are somewhat self-contained in some ways, they absolutely need to integrate with other cloud software, and it could be on-premises cloud or public cloud. So there needs to be API functionality that allows that, and it needs to be, again, to be able to tie into application release cycles as quickly as they go about. Infrastructure needs to be updated as well. Next slide. So let's talk about hybrid cloud in particular. HCI plays a critical role in this, but there's more to it, and I think we've had a bit of a challenge with this term, to tell you the truth. Hybrid cloud means different things to different people, which I'll get to in a second. But first, let's go to the next slide here. When we ask people, is your strategy hybrid? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. Very few say no. And how we define it is that you're using one or more services, and you're using on-premises services. A lot of folks are doing multiple clouds. They're not sticking to one cloud or another. The days of people just experimenting or using AWS and not using other solutions is long past. So overwhelmingly, people say, yes, my strategy is hybrid. However, next slide. How would you describe it? When we ask them that, you get definitions across the board. You have people that say, that kind of go with our definition, which is that it's an integration of public cloud with non-cloud resources, or multiple clouds and non-cloud resources, on-premises resources. You have people saying that it's about application workloads. You have people saying that it's using multiple clouds simultaneously. So we've had a lot of work ahead of us of trying to help define this. And the reality is that hybrid is not a set of solutions so much as it's an integration path. It's about integrating different technologies and integrating different processes. Whenever I hear somebody come to me and say, yeah, we sell hybrid cloud, I'm like, well, that's not a thing. You can't buy a hybrid cloud. You could buy various pieces of it and integrate it, and there's better ways of doing this than others, but there's no such thing as that I'm aware of where you can go to a given vendor and they'll sell you a hybrid cloud. If they tell you that, you should probably question what they're offering. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about here? So what is it then? Hybrid cloud. It's a set of challenges, really. It's at its basic level. It's about integration. It's about visibility of the data wherever it happens to live. It's certainly about data locality and cross-cloud security, and it's about portability. Not only the workloads themselves, but the software that runs it. It's also often very much so about latency and direct connect. So 5 to 10 years ago, folks were very gung-ho about the public cloud, and rightfully so. There's some cool stuff involved. However, public cloud does not serve every purpose. There's going to be times where you want to have a very low latency storage or server configuration, and then you want to have it close to home. You don't want to have it living in somebody else's data center. I'm not dissing public cloud, by the way. There's plenty of good reasons to use public cloud, but put the workload where it best belongs. Don't simply put it in a location that seemed like the most cost-efficient approach, because often, number one, it may not perform as well as you expect it to, but more importantly, number two, it tends not to be the most cost-efficient approach. You really need to look at every single application and workload and figure out, where does it best fit in terms of what you're providing for your customers and also what you're spending on the bottom line. Next slide, please. So when we talk about it, it's not a thing. It's not even a destination. It's a set of evolved operations. It's about looking at it from a management perspective as a combination of hybrid extensions of tools, SaaS on-premise tools. It's looking at applications as a tool chain, as integrations between pieces, as DevOps and SRE. It's looking at it data as a service in some ways. data sovereignty and security, which has become super critical in the zero trust world. And then lastly, it's the infrastructure. People love to talk about serverless computing, and they love to talk about functions and all that stuff, but it's got to run somewhere, right? And just as it runs on real servers in the public cloud, it runs on real services on premises. So the challenge you have here is to find tools and mechanisms and processes that bridge these gaps. And fortunately, there are options out there for that. Next slide, please. So just, going by the numbers, just to make clear, how important this is, 46% of our folks that we reach out to say, we already use 2 or more providers, 2 or more public cloud providers that they have to integrate internally. This number increases every year. I would not be surprised if it breaches 50% in our next survey. 65% of enterprises claim they have a hybrid IT environment already, whether or not they use multiple public clouds. 35% will deploy new apps exclusively in the cloud. And I want to be clear here that cloud in this definition can also mean private. What this means is that people are no longer building out the various pieces of an application and the infrastructure itself and kind of marrying it. They tend to build out a cloud solution that works across environments and then move the workloads around as needed. Obviously, not every application is suited for this, and certainly most applications that have been built up until this point were not built that way. But newer applications are starting to be put directly on these environments. Yet, only 31% maintain their own internal cloud service catalog, 43% do any sort of proactive cost management. So a lot of people are invested in this. You can see in the lower right how many people, there's folks that report that they're using 5+ vendors. There's actually we have numbers of people using 6 and 7 and 8, which is kind of shocking at first, but we are not against that. We're not against multiple clouds. We do think that there's probably a limit of how many vendors you want to play with when it comes to this stuff. Next slide. And use cases vary for cloud. I think this is a fairly obvious thing to say, but it's interesting to see how the numbers have changed over the years. So certainly when cloud started, a lot of people were doing lift and shift, and there was a tremendous number of folks that were moving via full VMs into public cloud, and we're seeing that diminish over time. People are starting to use, for purposes of application level queuing and message queuing, there's a huge growth of containers. We're starting to see a ton of folks re-architect their applications for this. And databases in general, specifically relational databases, but also non-relational databases. People find that they do like to run these things on premise, but they also like having the flexibility to put it into a public cloud service so that they can expand and shrink it as needed. Next slide. And just to give an idea of again, the change in approaches here, this is our most recent data. It turns out that the lift and shift section is slowly, getting smaller and smaller. We do see folks doing more full replacement, and that number is getting larger over time. We're also seeing, though, a huge number of folks that are extending through hybrid. They're realizing that I don't really want to put this particular system in the cloud. I want to use hybrid cloud services or public cloud services to augment my on-premises environment. And, I think we're going to see that continue to grow as people realize that, again, it's about where workloads and data should sit, not necessarily about having all your eggs in one basket, whether it's on-premises or public cloud. Next slide. And just to mention really quick, storage and DR are a couple good reasons why multiple clouds are used. When we ask folks, why do you do this? A good chunk of them are using them for disaster recovery processes. They're also using them to try to lower some costs, whether it's around compute or around storage itself. I think this is a kind of a fairly obvious thing to say. I think what's not as obvious is how this is also growing over time. I am not a proponent of using public cloud only for DR and BCP. I think it's a good place for DR and BCP, and it should be used for that. However, there's no denying that that's what a lot of people use it for, and that is growing over time. People are not really building out second data centers anymore. They're starting to use this as the primary location to store their secondary data, their BCP data. Next slide. So just in summary, I threw a lot of data at you, but what's interesting is that, having gone through this myself in my own personal career and also helping out our clients, is that there tends to be two approaches to hybrid cloud. There's what I call hybrid by accident, and there's hybrid by design. Hybrid by accident probably is very familiar to you. It's integrating public cloud with on-premises tech without really creating a standard approach and using infrastructure as code. It's shadow IT experiments that have good intentions, but suddenly become production. And then your infrastructure team is like, well, I didn't realize that was suddenly, no, went from being an experiment that a couple devs were using to, okay, this is now critical. And it's outdated governance practices that slow everybody down. It's, change management processes that, are killing productivity. And hybrid by design takes a different mindset, which is that if you're doing this and augmenting your environment, you got to realize that infrastructure as code is a different beast. And when I say infrastructure as code, I don't just mean containers. I mean programmable infrastructure, hyperconverged infrastructure, anything that's reachable through API. And it requires a different set of skill sets, policies, and practices. Your INO pros, they're developers now. I've gone through this transition myself. I was an administrator, and I realized that racking and stacking and watching lights, while it was very soothing, was not ultimately going to be the best career path. And I started learning how to develop, and not just script, but actually write to those APIs. So I highly encourage that folks go down that path, because you'll not only be able to program cloud resources, you're going to be able to program your own on-premises resources. You're not going to get anywhere without automation. Just be clear about that. Automation is super critical to this. Come to grips with the idea that security without automation is a fool's errand. We have a lot of reports and information about this on our site. You can't do this right without. You can't do security right without automation. And understand that legacy players, and I refer to a lot of folks as legacy players, and basically anyone who's been doing infrastructure for more than 5 to 10 years, are evolving alongside with you. They realize that their offerings need to be updated and improved, and they're doing that. And I think with that note, I think it's a good time to change over to our presenter from Pivot 3.
All right, thank you, Chris. So again, my name is Dan Deppen. I'm a senior product manager at Pivot 3, responsible for cloud-related products and hybrid cloud solutions. So some of you may or may not be familiar with Pivot 3 already, but we've been around for a very long time. Founded in 2006, and actually a lot of the foundation of our technology, the development on that started in the very early 2000s. Have in excess of 2,000 customers worldwide in over 50 countries and many thousands of systems installed. We were actually doing hyperconverged technology before that term was even invented. So we've got a lot of experience deploying HCI, running it in enterprise data centers in full production. And some of the key innovations that we're known for are typically our patented erasure coding, and then with the release of Acuity last year, our NVMe PCI flash data path, it gives us performance that's well beyond other HCI systems, up to 6 to 9x, in some cases, and 2 to 3x density for VDI applications. So Chris talked a little bit about how HCI has transformed the delivery of IT services. And so what HCI is doing is it's combining networking, storage, and compute, and taking these different buckets of functionality that, at one time maybe would be procured from different vendors, and then it had to be tuned and made to work together, which could be kind of a complicated process. And if you don't tune it just right, you may not get the performance you're looking for, to something where those three capabilities are converged together to where you can deploy this now in a way that's not only really flexible, but it's also very easily scalable. I kind of think of these as Lego bricks in a way. So when you want to scale, you just add nodes and plug them in. And then it's also based on just using commodity x86 hardware. So this is really a software-defined solution. It can run on hardware that you can find from, just about anywhere. You don't need any kind of, custom hardware or other things that you need to procure. You just take the Lego brick and plug it in, and you're good to go. But as we go forward into this world of multi-cloud, HCI is required to really do a lot more. So a lot of the traditional HCI architectures were designed for very targeted applications in limited use cases, typically test and dev, not production. And so they delivered a lot of flexibility and a lot of simplicity, but had some drawbacks on where they could be used. So as we want to take HCI and now apply it to hybrid cloud, the first thing we've got to be able to do is handle mixed workload environments. And so to do that, we got to be able to deliver not just high performance, but we got to deliver predictable performance for each of your workloads, and then still maintain that flexibility and simplicity. And that's something that Pivot 3 delivered last year with our Acuity product. So now if we look at what I call a conventional HCI architecture that's designed for more targeted application. So generally with these, the resources that are available to each application are going to be limited to the compute and storage within one of your nodes. Whereas at Pivot 3, what we've developed is a distributed scale-out architecture. And this allows an application that's running on one of the nodes to take advantage of, actually, in some cases, all the drive spindles from the entire array. So your capacity, IOPS, and bandwidth are aggregated, and now you can allow your applications running on the various nodes to have access to either all the resources or a subset of the resources. And so now this is beginning to set us up to be able to handle these mixed workload environments. Again, comparing the legacy architectures, they're typically a single tier of storage, so that limits the performance. You've got to make some decisions on whether you want to have SSD or HDD in your system. At Pivot 3, we use an architecture that's leveraging NVMe PCI Flash for the highest possible performance. And then we have the ability to tier to either SSD or HDD. So what this means is there's also a lot of intelligence in the system, so it puts the data on the most effective layer so that you can meet the SLAs for each of your applications. And so this is part of that enabling workload consolidations where you can have high priority workloads running on fast storage and lower priority workloads running on slower levels of storage. But what we've really had to do to enable these multi-workload private cloud environments is develop some really intelligent algorithms that make that possible. So first we have our automated data placement. So when we move the data between storage tiers, we're doing this in real time, and it's based on usage patterns of the data. And it gives the priority to trying to cache as much data or hold as much data on the NVMe flash layer. And then it tiers back to SSD or HDD only when necessary. So what it's doing is not just looking at the usage of the data, but it also looks at, not only looks at what data has been accessed, but it looks for patterns, and it can predict and do read ahead to see what data you're likely to want to read next. And it will actually pre-stage some of that data for you. So it's not just moving data to a tier of storage, which may be a familiar concept. There's actually a lot of intelligence around how it does this to make the most efficient use of the NVMe resources that it has. And then we have our policy-based performance. The administrator can select from very simple policies for each workload. And this is going to define the performance targets for each of those in terms of IOPS, throughput, and response time. And then there are also automated service levels. So with a few clicks, you can define what your mission critical, business critical, or non-critical workloads are. And then this informs the system on how to allocate the resources and allocate performance to each of those workloads. And then there's the policy-based data protection. So in addition to defining service levels for the workloads themselves, you can also define service levels for the data protection policies. So this will define the order of priority for data protection jobs, and you can also integrate this with applications. And what you end up with is an overall level of intelligence that's enabling this HCI solution to expand from something that was one time used for point solutions to now can handle private cloud environments with a range of workloads running simultaneously. And I gave you a real world example of how this intelligence engine can be put to work. So on the left, we have an example of a simple system with 3 workloads, and this would be on a traditional HCI solution. So in this case, each application has equal access to the performance and there's no prioritization of resources. But the applications each have different levels of criticality to the business. So your order database might be extremely important. Your development database, may not be as critical to your business as some of these others. So now if you have a situation where your development database, which is less critical, sees a high demand, this can create contention and can starve resources from your mission critical application. That can cause SLAs to be missed, can cause all sorts of problems. The way that we handle it at Pivot 3 with our advanced quality of service, user goes in, they define the service levels for each of the workloads. They say mission critical, business critical, non-critical. And so now if you have a situation where the non-critical workload sees a spike in demand, the system will give it as many resources as it can while ensuring that your mission critical SLAs get met. Now, if the mission critical application isn't making a lot of requests, well then your non-critical workload can get more resources. So this is not a dumb throttle or a cap, which you see some people call QoS. This is actually an intelligent system that gives the maximum resources to each application, but is guaranteeing that you're hitting your SLAs. And beyond that, you can even not only create policies and create service levels, but you can schedule those service levels as well. So for example, you might have some applications that during your work hours are very high level of criticality, but not as much in the after hours or weekends. And so you can actually have these priorities change based on a schedule. So you really have a lot of fidelity to tailor the system to meet the needs of your business. So that's how we handle private cloud environments, but what do we need to do now to extend this to this world of multi-cloud that Chris was talking about a little bit earlier? So the first thing we need to do is we need to have even more automation around decisions. And so the automation needs to relate not just to data placement, but actually the locations of the workloads as well. And then we need machine learning will be needed to constantly optimize the system. And so as you see things going forward, there will be a huge number of workloads that will have to be managed. And we see this actually today quite a bit at Pivot 3 in the security world, where we have a lot of customers who'll be running a number of applications on our system. So they might have, for example, say like a mall or a casino or an airport. They might have a application that's doing fire suppression for the facility. They might have one that's doing access control, that's controlling hundreds of doors. And then they might have another application that's doing video surveillance. They might have thousands of cameras on there. So you've got these very complex systems with a number of applications and thousands of endpoints. And it's very easy to see the trends of where these things are heading. These customers who today might have several thousand endpoints feeding data into the system and several applications, you can see where that's going to be growing to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of endpoints and hundreds of applications. So at some point in the future, those systems become so large and complex that it's really not going to be reasonable to have a human admin in the loop that can efficiently optimize a system like that. So at some point, the infrastructure needs to begin to optimize itself. And then we also need automation of application mobility. So what this means is not only understanding your environment and what the most efficient location is to run each of your workloads, but then the ability to actually move those workloads and do it in an automated fashion. And so that leads us to Pivot 3's vision for the intelligent hybrid cloud. And this is what we see as the answer to solve a lot of these problems in the industry. So the first thing we need is a private cloud that can handle multiple workloads, and not only do that, but also leverage legacy infrastructure. So I talked earlier about the need to be able to leverage commodity x86 hardware. And the other thing customers need to be able to do is leverage a lot of the hardware that they've already procured over time. So going to a hybrid cloud world can't mean doing forklift upgrades of your infrastructure. What you deploy has to be able to talk to that existing infrastructure and leverage those resources to ultimately optimize your costs. We can't be asking customers to do forklift upgrades. So today we can tie in and use existing storage and existing compute resources within our HCI solution. And then we also need the intelligence engine to be expanded to not only interpret the policies that the user is creating, but then begin to make automated decisions based on analytics, and then do automatic orchestration and deployment of those resources. So we need the private cloud tied into multiple public clouds, and then we need to be able to do analytics on each workload to understand what resources it needs, what its cost, how expensive it is to run that. And then we need to map that to the various clouds and the various physical locations where we might run that workload. And then once we know the optimal place for it, then be able to move it. So as we develop the intelligent hybrid cloud, these are a few of the use cases that we're focusing on first at Pivot 3. And the first one is backup and disaster recovery, which is, as Chris mentioned earlier, is one of the key use cases for public cloud. And what this will do is leverage the existing Pivot 3 data protection policy management and scheduling capability, and now extend that to the public cloud. And then next we have workload mobility, which really consists of two separate parts. So the first thing we need to be able to do is do that scan of an HCI system, identify all those workloads and characterize the requirements, and then map that to what it would cost to run those in the various clouds. And then the second step to that is to be able to actually move that workload. And then finally, we have archive, and that's the need to be able to optimize the cost of your storage by moving cold data to the cloud as needed. And then this is not just a movement of data either, but this will actually be having storage volumes span between on-premise data centers to the cloud so that all of your data remains online and available to the applications. I should mention too that, obviously there are a lot more use cases that we're looking at around hybrid cloud. These are some of the ones that we'll be implementing first. And as we go forward with our intelligent hybrid cloud, when we release different functionality is really mostly informed by our users. So we talk to hundreds of customers every week. We've also got a user group at Pivot 3 where we get a lot of excellent feedback. And so as we roll out these new capabilities, we're rolling them out based on what customers are asking for and what they're ready to go deploy, so that by the time we get to the future and we need some of these other capabilities, we've already got a well-worn path to get there and a lot of good feedback that's informing the user experience, the way that we built these applications. So going into some more detail about cloud for backup and DR, which was announced earlier today. So as Chris mentioned already, this is one of our key use cases for cloud. And this is a really big milestone for us because the Pivot 3 Cloud Edition for AWS it's not just a connector to the cloud, or it's not just a software fragment or a widget. This is actually the full version of Acuity that's running in AWS. And it's an important move beyond just running in a VMware environment. And it's the beginning of getting towards a software package that can run multi-cloud and then also multi-hypervisor. So really large milestone for Pivot 3. And then what this does is it integrates with our snapshot and replication technology so that you can now use AWS as a backup target. So you control all of this through the Pivot 3 management interface. You just select the Pivot 3 Cloud Edition for AWS as your target. It'll be running as an Amazon machine image there, and then you can replicate data from Pivot 3 to there, and then recover back to any Pivot 3 infrastructure. And then we're also working on extending the Pivot 3 Cloud Edition to be able to do cloud for archiving. So what this will do is integrate the Pivot 3 policy engine and enable the admin to create policies that will determine what data gets moved to the cloud and what data is kept on-prem. So the orchestration will tier data to the cloud, and it leverages our proven tiering technology, but will now enable cloud to be used as a low cost tier. And the important thing to point out here is that the storage volume is actually spanning between the on-premise infrastructure and the cloud. So from the application perspective, all of that data is available, with the caveat that if it has to pull data back from the cloud, there might be a higher latency, but it's not archiving in the terms of, what some people might think of as, shipping tapes to an offsite location where there's a time delay between when you can get your data. From the application perspective, we're doing archiving to save cost, but we're maintaining data availability at all times. And we're leveraging the intelligence engine that we already have that not just looks at data usage and puts the data in the right location, but it's also doing read ahead and predictive analysis to determine what data the customer is likely to need to access, and then it can pre-stage that on a warmer layer. So to summarize everything that I talked about here, so we covered how HCI has transformed the delivery of IT services and made things a lot more simple, a lot more flexible, and easy to deploy. And then we talked about how Pivot 3 software is architected for multi-workload environments, which create the foundation for creating private clouds. And then we talked about how this is being extended to a hybrid cloud environment and will eventually go to the world of multi-cloud. All right, so thank you. And with that, I believe we'll open it up for questions here in a moment.
Yeah, great presentation, Dan. Thank you very much, and great presentation as well from Chris at Forrester. So now it's time for our Q&A, but before we do that, I want to first announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. Today, that's going out to Paul Carter, who's live on the event with us today. Congratulations, Paul. So if you're out there in the audience and you have some questions about what you just heard, maybe around hybrid cloud or hyperconverged infrastructure, now's the time to ask them. We have two really veteran experts in their field ready to answer. So let's see, first question that came in here, Dan, is for you. And the question is about, when it comes to deciding what use cases that Pivot 3 should support with hybrid cloud, how do you make that decision? What use cases do you choose, and how did you decide?
Sure. So these are based primarily on the feedback that we get from our customers. We do a lot of talking to our customers, obviously, on a regular basis. We also do a lot of surveys and other research to understand what things they want to go deploy now, and then what things are important in the future. So, things that they want to do in the future obviously inform a lot of the vision that's been put together. But then as we roll features out, that's based on what customers have told us they're ready to go deploy now. So that's why we focused on backup first, because that was the key use case that they were clamoring to use right away. We're also doing a lot of work on things I mentioned, like workload mobility. But I think that's going to be a very important use case and capability coming here before too long. But we haven't had as many customers tell us that they want to go out and start doing that right this moment. So it's really the customer feedback that informs how we make those decisions on what we roll out when.
Okay, excellent. And then, Chris, a question for you here. They're asking, are there any workloads that you don't recommend running on HCI, or do all production workloads in your research work well with HCI today?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an exception. I want to be clear that, I'm not going to say necessarily that you never want to piece together the pieces yourself, but that is a very quickly growing, or I should say quickly shrinking segment of how people do production. Increasingly, just about everything is going on to hyperconverged, to the point where, major financial institutions are running their financial systems on hyperconverged. Media companies are doing their streaming services on hyperconverged. So I really don't think it's too much of a question anymore, as more of, is there a reason not to for any given application? And generally speaking, there is not a reason not to.
Okay, excellent. And then, Dan, another question that came in here, they're asking, when you define a data protection policy, exactly what does that entail, and how do you do it?
Sure. So, the first thing that entails would be doing things like setting the service level. So that's where you'll go in and you'll define what's mission critical, business critical, non-critical, and then that tells the system how to do the prioritization of the data protection jobs, the snapshots, and other activities. So if there's contention between those, it'll prioritize, but it won't actually start any of those. And then it also defines things like how often the data is protected. So, for example, how often are snapshots taken? How often are those snapshots retained? And then there's also scheduling options around when those snapshots are taken.
Okay. So it sounds very easy to do. Let's see. Another question here for Chris. The IT practitioners that you talk to, do they really trust automation to put the workloads in the right place?
So it's interesting. I think there's a growing segment of folks that are starting to understand they need to absolutely trust the automation. So if you look at every major outage in the past 5 years, whether it's public cloud or private enterprise, it's usually due to somebody manually fat fingering something. And I'm not going to, I'm not trying to diminish the ability of humans. I'm one of them, but I do think you need to rely on policies and software and algorithms as your data set grows. And we're at a stage right now, especially with containerization of applications and the sheer amount of data that's floating out there, that if you're not trusting automation, you are going to make a mistake sooner or later. So while it was a uphill battle for most people, I think a lot of I&O folks are finally realizing this is the time. I need to automate as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, great advice. Manual configurations just don't scale and they're error prone. So question, I guess, for Dan on that topic of automation, what sort of automations or tools or, what can you tell us about automation when it comes to Pivot 3?
Sure. So, we kind of began with automation of data placement. So once those service levels and policies are defined, the system's intelligence engine, understands how the data is being used, and it puts it on that most effective layer. As we go forward into the world of hybrid cloud, we'll begin to see automation not just for data placement, but actually workload and application placement as well. Okay.
And what sort of applications are people automating with Pivot 3, Dan? And anything specific, or can they automate everything?
Yeah, no, they can automate everything. So, within our system, it's not application specific. The system sees virtual machines and it sees data, and it's agnostic as far as what those are. Now, we do have, some cases where you can do some application specific integrations, but the full functionality of the system is available to any.
Okay. And another question that came in here, they're asking, how small does Pivot 3 start and how large can it scale up to?
Sure. So, the smallest systems would scale down to about 24 terabytes raw. And then on the large end, we can scale up to 1,260 terabyte nodes. So I can't do the math right in my head, but very large scale. And that would be within one VPG or virtual protection group. But then you can actually manage multiple VPGs within a single pane of glass. So we actually have a number of customers that have, in excess of 6-7 petabytes of data running within Pivot3. So extremely scalable.
Okay. And how do people, what's the use case where people typically, implement Pivot3? Is it a hardware refresh? Is it disaster recovery? Where do most people start using Pivot3?
Yeah, it really varies widely. What we're seeing more and more is production enterprise applications. VDI is particularly popular, although we're seeing more demand for database applications as well.
Okay. And what are, if somebody wanted to get started with Pivot3, what do you recommend? Do they go through a VAR? Do they contact Pivot3 directly to do a POC? Kind of what's the recommended steps?
Yeah, they can do either. If they go to our website, there's information there on how to contact us. We also have a very wide partner base worldwide as well. So going through the partners is always a good option as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have for now. Oh, hold on. One more question just came in here from Mike. Mike's asking, how do customers typically purchase Pivot3? Do they buy appliances or software only to install on their own servers? Dan?
Yeah, so we offer both options. So it can be purchased as an appliance, although you can also do software only. And we're seeing an increasing amount of software only, but both options are available.
Okay, and what hypervisor does Pivot3 support?
Running in VMware today, and then down the road, as we get into more multi-cloud scenarios, we'll also be getting into supporting multiple hypervisors as well. So stay tuned on that.
Nice. And the new announcement that you all had about Pivot3 in AWS, can someone who's just using AWS use that only, or is that meant more for like disaster recovery of existing on-premises Pivot3 deployments?
Yeah, so it's meant for backup and recovery of data running in a Pivot3 infrastructure. So the way the first version would be implemented is you'd be using the cloud as a backup target for what you're doing on premise. As we expand this and get support for more clouds and turn on more of the capabilities of Acuity that are running within the cloud edition, then you will get into more options to be able to go cloud to cloud and do other sorts of use cases.
Okay. Well, let's see. I think that's all the questions we have and all the time we have in today's event, but really great presentation. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Dan, for being on the event today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, for more information on Pivot3, you can contact them at the email on the screen, acuity@pivot3.com. Also visit their website, pivot3.com, and make sure you check out the resources that are available for download on your console. Thanks for joining the event today on the Pivot3 hybrid cloud solution. Have a great day.